Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Trick Horse Dan. Hello there. There was once a wonderful horse in Aberdeen, so wonderful that people wrote stories about him, and he made the newspapers more regularly than any local politician. He was a town personality. In fact, he was a personality known far and wide, and his owner treated him with the deference due a horse that was a personality. Moreover, this horse was a trooper, a performer of some distinction. He had more tricks than a traveling salesman, and his owner could pack the barn any evening in the week for this nag to do his numbers. So when Dick has taken a few seconds for words from our sponsor, we'll find the story in our scrapbook of Trick Horse Dan, one of Grays Harbor's best-known steeds from out of its sawdust past. And now a few words from Dick Crombie. To tell you about Trick Horse Dan, we must first find the paragraphs in our scrapbook about the Lowrys, for the Lowrys were part and parcel of the story of this famous horse. They figure in Grays Harbor's early history with the arrival in Aberdeen of Jim Lowry, his wife Catherine, and their 5 children. Jim Lowry had plans for a hotel, and he had been in town only a few days before he got his project started. It was 3 stories, with the first mansard roof in town, and a cluster of dormer windows along the 3rd floor roofline. The Lowrys soon became an institution on the harbor. The building, too, was an institution located at the western extreme of the business section. When it first went up on the southeast corner of Heron and I Streets, across from where Brower's is located today. But Big Jim Lowry was not long for Grays Harbor. Hardly did he have his hotel in operation, then he died. And the family of 5 children and the widow took over the work. Catherine was a capable manager of the hotel, but most of the work fell on the 2 boys, Jim Jr. and Bob. Jim took care of the details of the hotel operation, which Bob ran, and the livery stable that was necessarily a part of the hostelry facilities. It was located on Hume Street, State Street today, behind the present location of the Finch Building. Now it's Bobby Lowry and his penchant for horses that we're most interested in. He kept a string of horses to pull the dray that trundled in freight and express from the river boats to the commercial establishments around town. He met the river boats with his hack and hauled the tired travelers to the Pacific Hotel with their baggage. He had what we would consider a combination garage and service station today. He bought and he sold horses, and he broke them for riding or driving. He boarded horses for people who wanted to get away from their beast for a few days or a month. His livery stable was the headquarters for the stage line that clattered over the plank road to Hoquiam, and the line that carried the mail and the settlers and loggers up to Wishkah. We said that Bob Lowry bought and sold horses. He did, and one day he had a chance to buy a colt named Dan, who had given several owners a bad time and had gained a reputation of being a mean horse. He was, as Lowry noted, of no use to anyone, as mean and contrary an animal as could be imagined. The 3 owners who had bought and sold him in rapid succession were unable to break him, even to lead on a halter, and one owner was on the point of shooting the horse for his vicious habits. Lowry knew all of this, yet he had a hankering to try his hand with Dan, and he bought him cheap. Somehow, he told friends, he felt the cut-up characteristics of the horse were just plain high-class horse sense. Now, Bob Lowry had a way with horses. Old-timers recall that he could get more out of a horse than any other man who could handle one. And he soon taught Dan, who was to be master. And although Dan was a 3-year-old and had spent all of his 3 years in pasture, because no one could break him for work, Bob Lowry soon had a horse saddled and rode him down Heron Street, Dan's head and tail high, and trotting with a spirited step. People who knew Dan were amazed. He had been as balky as a mule any time anyone approached him. But Bob Lowry was astride him and cantering down through the sawdust 2 weeks after he bought the horse for a reported $20. Moreover, in another 2 weeks, the frisky nag that had almost gone to the glue factory for his conspiracies was taking his turn with the hotel bus. From that day on, Dan began to show the promise that Lowry had predicted for him. In 2 lessons on the sawdust in front of the Hume Street livery stable, Dan learned to lie down and roll over, or play dead. He developed a troupe of string tricks, and in a few months' time, Trick Horse Dan was the talk of the harbor. When Dan took him to Hoquiam, a crowd gathered whenever he stopped, and people never tired of seeing the horse do his famous political speech that he had to repeat over and over for amazed populace. Lowry taught Dan to stand on a stump, throw his head up, and move his lips, as though delivering the most important oration. He would thump the stump with his front hooves, shake his head with emphasis, and then, when he had finished with a resounding flourish, Dan would throw back his head and treat his audience to a resounding horse laugh, which always brought down the house. At Lowry's order, Dan would kneel on his front legs, put his head down, and groan a devout prayer. And when his master shouted, "Amen," the horse would leap to his feet and panic his audience with a horse laugh. Children liked to watch the horse sit back on his haunches and take a curved stem pipe between his teeth, as though he was enjoying a good smoke. If anyone dropped a handkerchief, Dan picked it up and returned it. Moreover, the horse had tricks of his own that he performed without warning, and hardly a day when Bob Lowry brought this animal out onto the sawdust of Hume Street was there any lack of a crowd on hand. To the kids of the town, Dan was everything that a circus should be. Still, Trick Horse Dan, as he was known to the entire harbor, paid his way. He worked with the rest of the horses in the livery stable. Sometimes he hauled the dray, sometimes the hack or the gurney. He seemed to enjoy work now that he could play along with it. One pioneer Aberdeen resident recalled, when I talked with her up this week, that new husband had once hired a carriage for a drive to Hoquiam. It was a 2-horse rig, and Dan was one of the horses. At every slough between Aberdeen and Hoquiam, Dan would confuse the driver by threatening to jump the slough rather than take the bridge that spanned it. And then, as it does to all players, Dan had his big chance. The old Acme Opera House was in town's pride. It stood about where Mac's cigar store is located today, on Wishkah Street, across from Messingel's and Rosevere's music shop. And one of the town's active social groups had planned an amateur theatrical performance. They had the usual routine of dance numbers, a barbershop quartet, the musical selections, and sleight of hand. But they needed a star. Someone suggested Trick Horse Dan. The rest laughed. Then something about that idea sounded good. They had a long talk with Bob Lowry, who promised something entirely new. And Dan was billed as the star of the show. It was the spring of 1898 when the Acme Opera House filled with excited showgoers to see something that they had known was most proper, a real stage demonstration of the dramatic abilities of Trick Horse Dan. When the lights went down and the curtains were raised, their quota of chuckles, it came time for the spectacle of the evening. In the orchestra pit, Alex Castring's three-piece ensemble, which had been engaged for the show, provided a roll of drums as Trick Horse Dan came down the aisle, led by his master. At the request of Lowry, the applause was withheld until the horse was on stage. Then the audience clapped thunderously. Dan bowed to the left and to the right and stepped before the footlights to the accompaniment of the orchestra. He delivered the first horse tender solo the town had ever heard. He waltzed with his trainer, delivered a short address, and bowed to conclude his act. Moreover, he mounted and dismounted the stage on a long flight of stairs with the grace that was noted by the town's newspaper reporters. From that day forward, he began to take piano lessons. Bob Lowry taught him to wear a halter with a leather pointer like a misplaced unicorn's horn, with which he tapped the keys on the piano. Moreover, about once a week, Dan entertained in the front of the Pacific Hotel, often on spring and summer evenings, when he had hauled the hack back to its last run on the docks. Bob Lowry would put his trick horse through the paces. Crowds would flock to the corners to see the show, of which the town's children never tired. And when Dan had gone through his paces, the children crowded around him and under his feet without fear, for Dan was the favorite horse of all the Aberdeen kids, and a much different horse from the violent nag that Lowry bought for $20. We said that Dan was famous, and indeed he was. Newspaper editors lamented that the horse of his superior intellect must do so much common work as drawing the bus or the hack or the boat landing or pulling the dray through the town to deliver a truck. Dan should be touring the nation, carrying the name of Aberdeen before audiences all over America, said editor John Carney of the Aberdeen Herald. Such was the horse that early Grays Harbor knew and still recalls as Trick Horse Dan, and old-timers agree that there was never another like him. And now a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. Yes, Trick Horse Dan was quite a figure in early Grays Harbor. He appeared in the earliest parades, carrying his master and performing in the procession to the great pleasure of the townfolk, who considered Dan a sort of personal emblem of the sawdust town. There are not many harborites still among us who recall the tricks of Bob Lowry's famous horse. But there are many who have heard the stories of this intelligent animal from an elder who talked with relish of the horse that used to pack them in when he gave a show, the horse that had the superior horse sense, and who escaped the glue factory only because a young fellow named Bob Lowry took a shine to him and decided that he wasn't a mean, tricky nag, but frustrated and intelligent animal who needed an audience to play to and a bag of tricks to perform, and turned him into one of the most famous horses that ever cantered through the streets of Grays Harbor and into the pages of our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.